Hello, and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care. A 0% error rate, an inspiring story on how you get there. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Mary Kay Tyler, Chief Quality and Compliance Officer at Hospice of the Western Reserve. She shares strategies for achieving the elusive goal of improved clinical documentation. As Mary Kay discusses, you start with what can make the biggest impact. For GIP, that is often physician and NP documentation. We break down how she leveraged her EMR, fostered buy-in, and cultivated accountability, and remembered to listen throughout the process. Now go get a pen. You won't want to miss any of these helpful takeaways. Mary Kay, you're one of my favorite people. I'm so glad that you're here. So thank you for taking the time to share what are really helpful insights. So,
well, I'm happy to be here.
So you and I did a little pre-planning on the session, and I came up with, as you were explaining all of the things you have done internally, sort of broke things down into sort of 6 different buckets. And I think for our listeners, this is so helpful because everyone is dealing with could be a number of TPEs at the moment, and you have CPI audits and all these other things, right? And so you feel buried, and then you're supposed to be making improvements, and how do you do that? And so when you and I were talking, what really struck me was just, breaking it down and focusing on the things that matter, right? Because going and telling people like, be better doesn't really move the mark, and you really moved the mark and made meaningful difference. And so wanted to share some of those secrets and magic or whatever. So the first thing that struck me was, I call it the biggest bang. You can't do it all at once. Who do you focus on first? And so in the intro, I talked about physician and NPs, and we're talking about GIP documentation in particular, but you really felt that those were the professionals on the team that could have the biggest impact, right?
Right. Really looked at, when I sit down and do a summary, where am I looking for that summary information? And so I thought, well, I first look at the physician or NP documentation. Obviously, you got to review the entire chart, but that was my starting point. So worked very closely with our chief medical officer. And underneath the quality team, we do have our computer education team, our clinical software team. So by putting those 2 groups together, really worked on how can we improve the documentation by our physicians and nurse practitioners to really paint the picture better. I mean, obviously, we all believe that we're providing the right level of care. We just need to have that documentation that demonstrates that. And our physicians, bought into that because we sat down not just with the medical director, but a couple key physicians who are in our inpatient facilities and said, okay, this is why this patient's here. Tell me more about it. And you could pull out from their conversation that there was a lot more behind their decision than what was in their documentation. So now, okay, we got to get that documentation, and did it with real patients at the real time. Right now, this patient's here. Tell me why. Hey, look at your documentation from yesterday. That really doesn't tell me what you just told me. So let's go over it. And we sat down really word from word to try to give them some better key phrases to use.
And I think that's so important because, right, sometimes we get wrapped up on doing everything all at once, and everything needs to be perfect. And what we're trying to do is move the mark. And so I totally agree with you. It's like, well, what did the physician say, or the NP? That's the first thing you're going to jump to. So, of course, if you're trying to improve documentation, isn't it focusing first on those people? But I really, because, right, everyone could improve their documentation, nurses, chaplains, maybe chaplains don't need to improve their documentation. They're usually really robust, but most people could. And just that drumbeat of, oh, just be better. And we're going to break down what better is. But I think that was a really helpful insight of who am I going to focus on first, because they're going to make the biggest difference. Like, could they make a 50% difference in the overall, if we're looking at the overall quality of the documentation supporting the level of care of the physician and NP? And then the second, and you mentioned this is, and it's the second point on my list, was leveraging your EMR. So,
right.
There's many fabulous things about EMRs, and there's many things that are real frustrating. And in our operational series, we're talking about EMR glitches because I feel like we're constantly dealing with some pretty big EMR glitches. But speaking on the plus side, there's a lot of things you can do to customize your EMR to make information easier to be comparative for physicians and other things so that they can look at things, right? We say we want clinicians to be comparative, but if they have to go through 10 million screens to get there, is that really going to be very helpful, and are they really going to do it? So can you share some tips you did with your EMR?
Sure. One of the things to reduce having to click from one screen to the other to get information was to add a plan of care summary section. So our EMR, you are able to bring elements forward. So you would need an EMR that can bring some. So we customized bringing that section forward. So whoever was seeing the patient, one provider saw the patient on Monday, and maybe there is a different provider that comes for day 2 of GIP. They would see that brief summary of the plan of care, and it would have a date and the physician's initials at the end of it. And then when they did their documentation, they would then put that brief, and it's usually only 1 to 2 sentences. It's not, really a lot of work for them to do, but it is a free narrative that they can add. And then when you're looking at it, you see that running summary each day. Now, we ran up to, if someone's in GIP for a very long time, we do have to start deleting some of the first entries. But really to teach people, maybe it's 5,000 characters that's in that field. So that has been very helpful to really get a sense of, hey, what have we been working on for the last 3 days? And this is the new change on day 4 that makes a difference. So that, I think that was very helpful.
Well, and when you say care plan, right, it is like the critical document, but oftentimes you don't see care plans change, or not as often as I think ideally you'd want. So how do you tell the story? It's hard to say, oh, all these things are going on, but not a lot has changed, because you have to find the changes through the individual clinical notes as opposed to the care plan, which is the overarching thing. So that's really interesting. So was that based on feedback that you got from this outreach with your physicians about, well, I'd like you to be more comparative, and
it was based on the feedback and the fact that we had a couple providers, that would just come in for a day to cover when someone was off. And so we made sure we not only talked to the providers that are normally there, but the ones that we're covering, and said, how are you struggling with knowing what you need to know about the patients? And that was brought forward by the people that don't spend a lot of time in the unit. Hey, I would like a really quick summary. And I do look at the other documentation, but probably not as thoroughly as I don't have time.
Yeah.
There's a limited amount of time for all of us.
Which bleeds into this third point, which is it takes a village. Compliance, right? You are not just one person. I mean, you have a team of people, but still, right? I mean, you're a really large organization. I mean, how many hospice patients do you have on?
We have 1,300 hospice patients.
1,300 hospice.
3 providers.
Okay, and how many units do you have, GIP units?
4 GIP units.
So obviously
Mhm.
you and your compliance team can't just will this to happen, right? So you
Correct,
really
right.
need to get other people to buy into it, to carry water for you. And so it can't just come from on high from compliance, because we know that that fails, right? If you just say,
It
come on,
certainly
do
does.
this. So how did you approach this differently under this sort of guise of it takes a village? When you decided to say, okay, I'm going to take GIP and have
Mhm.
this particular goal in mind, how did you approach it differently than
Okay.
maybe something else you have in the past?
I think our physicians and nurse practitioners, we've cultivated over the last couple of years, really keeping them informed on what's going on. You know, what CMS is looking at, what OIG is looking at, and they really have, and that's by regular attendance at their staff meetings. It may only be 10 minutes in their staff meeting, but it really, and getting the Pepper report out to all of them. Since we are a large
Mm.
institution, it can't just be, let's get it to leadership and the CMO. It needs to get to the ground level. So we've cultivated that over the last couple of years. And so for this, what we decided, we leveraged a reporting system that we have that takes information out of our EMR and can create reports for us.
Mm.
And we designed a report that gave us every day, the CMO, myself, our CEO, and our chief clinical officer get a report of all the patients in GIP for greater than 5 days. That report is then sent to whoever's at the units. And the expectation is they're to respond to that email to the chief medical officer justifying why that patient's still in GIP. Just once again, it is a quick sentence. It's not
Mhm.
a narrative. We're talking 3-4 words. Sub-Q medications being used, a new symptom of agitation, whatever that is, and it's justified. Or their response is, hey, we're changing them to routine home care today. Or your report's wrong. They changed to routine home care over the weekend. Go
Mm.
see what's wrong with your report. So, we have found some other interesting things in doing
Yeah.
that. But that's really given the ownership back to the actual providers who are making that decision. Once again,
Mhm.
stressing, we believe they're making the right decision. Let's just have some transparency to that decision for leadership to see, and then for us to feel more secure. That has really been helpful. And I think they bought into it very well. I mean, we didn't get any pushback like, oh, you're just watching us, or
Yeah,
there was
yeah,
really
yeah.
no negative. But we had these conversations, but we didn't just do it. We talked through it. What do you think about this? How would that work? And they were all very receptive. And I'm talking both physicians and NPs, because we don't,
Hmm.
every day, we don't necessarily have a physician at our unit. It may be an NP.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and then in our unit that's a little larger, we made one person the contact, even though there may be 2 providers that day. And then that way it was very clear they know who's supposed to do that. They weren't, oh, is he doing it today or is she doing it
Yeah,
today? And there
yeah.
wasn't that confusion.
Well, and I think what you say about sharing compliance things regularly. So it's
Mhm.
not just Mary Kay says this, right? This is what the government's concerned about. And so there's buy in, right? Every job, every person's job has a compliance element to it, right? So it's
Correct.
not a department, it is really an obligation of everyone. And so I think pulling that through into, if I'm going to have a compliance initiative of improving documentation, that sort of it takes a village, because, and I do think you need to deal with this whole compliance fatigue or improvement fatigue. People get like, ugh, you keep
Of
asking me to
course.
do more and more and more. And I think, my reflection as you're talking is you focused on pretty, I don't want to say small things, but right, it's not like write 2 paragraphs every day
Right.
about why the person is eligible. It's like we're carrying through this care plan thing. And then with your 5-day report, you're not expecting them to like over respond, right? Because we expect they do have their eye on the ball and that they can very quickly say, yeah, this is why this person, I know they're on day 6 of GIP, but they need it because, and then they fill in that sentence as opposed to making it, I want, this beautiful narrative.
And I think that was key, that we were realistic in what we were expecting people to do.
Yeah.
And we didn't make these changes. We have a new CMO. He's been here just a year now, but he actually got to experience using our EMR, and he still does it on a regular basis when he's covering it. The same with myself, really trying to keep up. Now, usually they have to fix some of my documentation. I do make errors. The team does get a little nervous. But anyway, still being experienced and be able to really talk realistically. There's another section of their note that is pre-populated so they can click which the symptoms are. And we added some very important narrative to those. And I'll just give you one example. Medication adjustment requiring 24/7 skilled nursing monitoring, which cannot be managed in the home setting. So by adding cannot be managed in the home setting or some variation of that, I think that it put a lot more weight on these statements. And then, their summary may then say, increased medication frequency to Q1 hour, something like that. But some of this they can easily click, which is helpful also.
That is so helpful. I was just emailing a client about reviewing some GIP examples, and I feel like they read part of the guidance about when GIP is appropriate, but then not paying or being as attentive to the second half, which is it cannot be managed in another setting, right? And like hitting that home, it's not just about the pain and symptom management. It's like, and it can't be managed anywhere else but here, right? And I think that sometimes documentation just really says, well, they have this condition and they're getting IV medication, so of course. And it's like, well, you still need to say more, like, could we try something else? Or so I think that that's really smart and really helpful. So then, and you talked a little bit about this, and so the fourth thing on my list was how to build accountability and the role of leadership. And it sounds like, so you do all this proactive stuff and you do this with your EMR. And so is the accountability piece really in those, for people who are on over 5 days, this leadership report, is that where the accountability comes in?
Not that the ones for less than 5 days aren't, in the appropriate level of care, but yes, I think the providers realize that they are going to need to respond to that email. I have to say there's 100% response. Sometimes it's a little later in the day than we'd like, but we usually get, hey, I'm swamped. Email's coming. There's a quick email that we know that's coming out. And so really 100% compliance with them responding to it and knowing that, there's an important reason for why we're asking this question. And then we did share with them when these changes resulted in a substantial decrease. I mean, we went to a 0 error rate and we had double-digit error. I don't want to say exactly how high it was, but it was high. And really made sure that they were thanked for that and that we've continued to make modifications as they've brought them forward. And I think that I really do think that the providers feel that it's a joint effort and this is a team approach. They do know that nursing's next on the list to improve. And I think, we've also gotten their input. What would you like to see in the nursing documentation that's going to help you?
You beat me to it. The fifth point I had on my list is the balancing doing with listening and reevaluate regularly because, right, we just need to begin and then evaluate whether or not that was helpful, right? And if you found out everything you just did wasn't moving the marker, abandon it, right? Start with
Right.
something else, get feedback. Why did that not work? Because sometimes I think we get scared. Well, I put a lot of time into doing this and I thought it was going to work, and then just pushing harder on the same thing, and it's like I got to get feedback, and I got to, hear from others, because what I thought was going to work isn't really moving the mark. Now, you nailed it. I mean, to have a 0% error rate, I mean, is remarkable, and kudos, like you said, not just to the compliance team, but all of your providers. And let's just say, it's not that care was any different or that people are
Correct.
more eligible. It's just connecting those dots in a more clear way, which I think really, when your audience for this documentation is a reviewer who may not, will never see this patient, may not have tons of familiarity with hospice, right? Like, you need to lead
Right.
them and connect the dots. And so it's a real testament to, I think, building your idea with input on the front end and then reevaluating it again with those same people about what's working, what's not working. And you had the good fortune that, wow, out of the gates, you got
Right.
a lot of movement, positive movement. And so then the last thing I had on my list was persistence, right? Because have we solved this problem forever, right? Like,
Who knows?
who knows, right? And so it's probably worth, because, like, when do you stop sending the emails for the patients on day 5, and do we keep that forever?
We're going to keep it for a while. We really don't see it as a burden. No one is complaining that it's a burden right now. So as long as the scrutiny, now we may have to add, other things to that.
Yeah.
So if we identify another area and things kind of stay quiet in the GIP area a year from now, maybe,
Yeah.
we would focus on something else. And one of the things that I'm kind of focusing in on, and I know this is off subject, is those certs of terminal illness, because you sit in team and you listen to what they're saying. And then I go and look at the cert and I'm like, you really provided some good education, Dr. Smith, and I don't see it in your cert. And, we got to somehow get that information, because once again, the reviewer may have no medical knowledge, and you need to get that to them. So we'll probably keep it for another year. And if things quiet down, we'll change the focus. We don't want to overwhelm and have two things at the same time. But
I think that it is really important in terms of trying to figure out the disconnect sometimes, and because I've done a lot of documentation training in my day, and I feel like the audience is really important. Like, who are you writing this for? And I think they think they're writing it for themselves, or like the physician that comes on tomorrow. But it's like, you're really writing this for some third-party reviewer 3 years from now who may look at this, right? And so it's got to stand on its own, right? And so it's got to give enough color. But sometimes I think giving folks perspective on who is the audience for your documentation, because that may lead you to use less shorthand. Like, a lot of physician notes have lots of shorthand. I mean, now when people can type, I think it's a little bit better, but still there's a lot of medical language and things that people don't necessarily understand, because another physician is not really going to be reviewing this, right? It's going to be a clinician who may or may not have any hospice experience. So, and ultimately, if you have to appeal it, you're going to go to an administrative law judge who is a lawyer and knows nothing about medical stuff, right? So, and I think it's an important skill for, and we talk about physicians having to expand their role as being advocates, right? Because so often you have to appeal cases and your physicians need to feel comfortable looking at it from another perspective, because when they have to look at documentation from 3 years ago and scratch their head and be like, okay, why did I think this? I wish I wrote more, right? Like,
Right.
so I think both the perspective of who your audience is, but also this 5-year rule, like this document has to stand up, 5 years from now, that I can know why I did what I did and all that stuff, because it is really that contemporaneous documentation that's going to be the most persuasive than me saying 5 years later, well, this is what I was thinking. But it's not documented. So that persistence, I think, is really helpful, and great to know that you're not running into that fatigue where people are just like, I'm going to just peace out because you just keep asking more and more of me, and I want to spend time caring for my patients and not do all of this stuff. But I also think seeing that it was so successful and resulted in a 0% error rate on GIP, I mean, that's remarkable. That's huge.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I do think, as you've said a couple of times, the buy-in and working with the providers was key. We didn't just hand them something that the quality team came up with, because those interventions almost always fail. So
we learn from those mistakes, right?
Like, certainly have.
Because I do think it's like, well, this makes sense to me in compliance, but it was a blending of what do you look for when you write a summary, and then partnering with the people who are documenting and say, here's what I need, here's what you do. How can we blend these together and really make a difference? But, well, I told you should frame that letter. And,
yes, I think, and I'm keeping it in my office. Yes. I want to see it on a
exactly, because it is just a wonderful story. And I think that, you're still providing the great care, but the more you can connect the dots and make it really clear for reviewers to say, oh, yeah, these symptoms cannot be managed in another setting because, and then they are answering that question in their documentation and not just in an esoteric way. Like, that's in the back of my mind, but you're really completing a sentence that has that built in.
Correct.
Awesome. Well, this was an inspiring story to me, and because I feel like people always like to hear happy endings, obviously, but also just something meaningful that you did that made a difference, and harnessing your EMR, which it sounds like played a really big role in terms of what you're able to accomplish. So yay to EMRs. They have tons of value if we can use them correctly.
Certainly do. Thank you.
I so appreciate you taking the time to share all of your insights. This is an incredible story, and I think really great takeaways for our listeners. So,
all right, my pleasure.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.